Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 493 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with sculptor Kim Dickey. She uses the structures and flora of the garden as a springboard to create large-scale floral forms made from hundreds of individual pieces. In this interview, we talk about her process of working with multiples, as well as her exploration of cast concrete. We also talk about her feminist claiming of space through ornamentation, in her recent solo show, Auguries, which is up at the Robichon Gallery in Denver, Colorado, to the end of the month. If you'd like to see examples of her work, you can go to kimdickeystudio.com. I also wanted to mention that Kim has been a longtime professor at UC Boulder. It's one of the most dynamic ceramic programs in the nation, so if you're a potential graduate student, I recommend that you do some research and check the program out. You can find out more about that by going to colorado.edu/art and art history. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to plug the merch sale that I've got going on in the shop. Until the end of the month, you can get 20% off your purchase by using the code RedClayRambler at checkout. The website is talesofaredclayrambler.com/shop. One of the best ways that you can support this show is by leaving a comment and a review on your favorite podcast app. So for the holidays, if you're feeling generous, please go out and give this podcast a review and a rating, as well as our other shows on the Brickyard Network. So without further ado, let's get on with the interview. So the recent show that you have is at the Robichon in Denver. So the show is called Auguries, and that relates to this system of taking omens from birds, which goes way, way back. Can you tell us a little bit about that and then how that is played into the show?
I have been very interested in the way that animals, birds and other animals we sort of look to them for cues in the landscape, as well as just in our daily lives, and this incredibly close relationship. We tend to associate and project our own feelings onto these creatures, and then also they share our lives in such intimate forms. So I think in this really uncertain time that we're all living through, I think it's very natural for humans to look for signs for the future in the landscape around us, and right now it's a critical signal to how we should behave, perform, and it's incredibly instructive. So I think that when I was working on this body of work, I became more and more fascinated, and this is just the nature of the work I've been doing for a long time, trying to sort of foreground what's in the background, to pay attention to what's happening behind the scene, that the scene, the setting, is a character in the narratives that we live in, of the play that we're involved in here, and so this. When I stumbled on this tradition, this Roman tradition of augury, it's very funny too in some ways, because the observation of birds, and not just certain kinds of birds, so falcons, eagles, but chickens as well. Their behavior, their flight patterns, their feeding patterns were closely studied and actually informed the decisions of the state. And I thought to myself, that's not absurd. I can go there. In fact, perhaps decisions of the state could be but sort of better informed by the feeding patterns of chickens. Maybe that's not so much of a stretch if we paid attention. So I thought about it and was interested in the way I think in times of uncertainty we're all feeling that, looking around us desperately to know how to go forward, to know what to do next, to understand what the future might hold. And I think post pandemic, we're all in that sort of very, I think, vulnerable state, right? This, yes, extraordinarily tender kind of moment. And so in developing the show, I really wanted to make that kind of a space and have the work signal that vulnerability, that tenderness, that both fear and hopefulness, and that kind of mix that's wistful, if you will, but also fearful. And auguries, I think we have a really complex relationship to birds, right? I mean, they're both domestic creatures as well as birds of prey. They can be quite threatening if you think of, Alfred Hitchcock's, films, or Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, and so I wanted to create that kind of space, that sort of, if you're not really sure what's going on in terms of what is being signaled, and we can't read the signs, though the signs are present, which is also, I think, part of this um, exploration, is that uh, these signs are interpreted by readers, and it's really dependent on how the readers receive and interpret them, right? So, and they're not always correct, whatever correct is, right? So we're all at the mercy of interpretation, as well. And I think that actually speaks to how artworks can be received in such a huge variety of ways, right? That are very very much a personal reception, based on experience and association, and that's what makes them extraordinary and rich, and why I keep making, because they also perform meaning in a way that I don't even anticipate. As we start with an idea that we're grappling with, what unfolds and what you learn through the process of making those things is different than what your, n- n- you know, perhaps beginning intentions are. I think that's, the work has a life of its own, right? Artwork has a life of its own, and that's what makes it so compelling. How it goes into the world and makes its own meaning.
In the show, the way that you handle color, I think, is interesting. A lot of those figures, the animal figures, are whites, grays. Like something that's, I don't want to say it's a flat color, but it does not jump out at you. But then the pieces that are based on tapestries, like that is all like color. And I think that color relates to the garden and the reference that you've done in your career for decades now. But can you talk about how you're using color here and if that color has any meaning?
This show is interesting because I was aware of the sort of difference between that, the big piece that is on the wall is called Six Sense, and it's based on these six Cluny tapestries that they're at the Cluny Museum in Paris, and they are based on the five senses. Plus, there's sort of one about desire, which is very enigmatic. And the work, by the way, in the show spans a 5-year period. So that one is the earliest of the works, and as you say, the most colorful. The backdrop of these tapestries is unusual because it's this rich red, which typically in those backdrops, these millefleur backdrops, they're typically sort of bluish green, and these thousand different kinds of flowers happening. And so what's interesting is that in the I what I do with those tapestry images is I start to make a collage. If I can, restitch them in my own image. So I took all of the sort of backdrops and the framing, which are these four trees and this beautiful pool of kind of blue in the foreground, and removed all the human actors, the woman, the unicorn, also the large central actors. There's a lion, there's all sorts of accoutrement, they're like objects. And I wanted to, as I say, foreground that background and allow the teeming kind of activity of the backdrop. And there are lots of animals and rabbits and dogs and fox and so on, as well as these crazy, gorgeous leaves and flowers to be the action. And if you look, the other thing that is really, and by the way, just to give you some insight into the sort of process of how I make these. Um, it's an aluminum frame and they're in 6 panels that are then joined together. The aluminum structure is clad with terracotta leaves, and they're held in place with silicone and rubber grommets, and they have a kind of pegboard. It's a pegboard structure in some ways. And it's funny too, because everything is glazed in raw majolica, and then I project the image that I've created from these different tapestries onto the piece and paint them with stains, mason stains, onto the majolica. And it's really important that it's projected to incorporate that distortion that happens while painting on a 3-dimensional surface, because they're these little quatrefoils. They're 4-leafed flower or leaf. It's a sort of every leaf kind of form, a motif, from art history or decorative histories. And it's also for me, like, it's like a pixel, it's like a stitch, it's a grid pattern, it kind of references all these other traditions in our history as well. But I have about 150 different mason stains that are in little
Oh,
cups
wow.
in front of me. So I'm painting in to the projection in the dark. So the richness of color is this huge palette that I'm responding to. But then, of course, as you know, this Italian majolica tradition is just incredibly rich and beautiful, and it captures painting in such a perfect way and freezes it in this low luster setting for forever. It will never fade. It will never degrade. And that's what's so extraordinary about ceramics. So, one other just note about this: in the process of painting this, and it took 3 years on and off. I'm doing lots of projects at the same time, so things get sort of stopped and started. And this was designed for a show in Limoges that was C'est le Bouquet. And I did 2 of the panels and completed them, and then finished the rest of the 6 over the pandemic, actually. Um, and in painting these, one of the things that I saw is that all the flowers in the backdrop are actually, rather than like rooted in the ground the way the foreground is, they're all curved stems that are visible. And it looked like someone threw an entire giant bouquet, and they're all sort of frozen in suspension in the air. And it's quite startling and magical. And that idea of suspension and um, is something I wanted to capture in this empty stage that seems like a pause. It's sort of waiting for the actors to arrive, or they've just left. We're not even sure. But there's this sort of betweenness that is engaging. In contrast to that major sort of piece, because it's 6 feet by 9 feet, I wanted to show these works that are both bronze and also bronze glazed. So a number of the works are totally in ceramics, are completely made in terracotta, but they're glazed to look like metal. So they have this sort of darkness and richness and weight. And then I have 2 giant bronze pieces in the show. So one is 4 feet high, called The Impossibility of Letting Go, and the other is called Time Out. It's a sort of rabbit paused on a threshold, or waiting to be thinking about to wash, but also obviously preoccupied. And so both of them were also commissioned during the pandemic, and I hadn't a chance to ever show them. So they're part of this edition that I did. And then there are a couple white, well, there's some other pieces that are tile pieces that are influenced by those tapestry works that I've been doing for a number of years. And then also a couple white birds that flank it's actually one's a bat and one's an owl, a great horned owl, that flank the Sixth Sense tapestry, and they are white, and that's intentional for them to sort of disappear into the background, the white wall, become part of the architecture, but also appear ghostly and a little bit haunting. And so the color, I'm thinking about them in relationship to materiality, and the weight of material, and also ideas of disappearance and appearance. And I'm really interested in architectural ornamentation and
Mhm.
where it lands and where it comes from and how we become aware of it and how it instructs us or emphasizes a narrative that's in the background, and all those are influences in this work.
We're going to come back to this show, but when you mentioned the architectural aspects, it made me think about the work you've done in cast concrete, which the forms, are made in clay and then molds are taken and you cast them. But a lot of these figures are almost these. I'm thinking about the installation at Sloan Kettering in New York, the deck of the sixth floor of the hospital. What it reminds me of is walking through New York City and looking up and seeing like the things at the tops of buildings. This happens in Paris. All these big cities have these massive concrete things. You've brought in some ways a personal touch to them because you can see the hand in the original clay sculpture. But then they're also, when something is concrete, the materiality of concrete is so mundane, but you've made it so special and beautiful. And also just the significance of bringing beauty to a cancer ward is like, I think, a really important thing. So can you talk about that material as meaning in that instance?
It was such a meaningful project, as you say, just to be able to think really about who would be the audience for this work. It's on the sixth floor of the Memorial Sloan Kettering a cancer ward, and it's where the cafeteria is and the symposium rooms, and where family and friends visiting, as well as patients and doctors, would come and sit, rest, eat, um, recover, um, project into the future, right? It wraps three sides of the building, so and the building's a whole city block, so it's huge garden space that they've made, and walkway. So it's almost like a little mini High Line. The program that was sort of given to me was about celebrating New York. So one of the things, and that's kind of a wonderful, having basically grown up in New York and then spent 13 years there, living there. It was, for me, a deeply meaningful project to be able to kind of, especially since I've been in Colorado for 25 years now, to kind of come home, if you will. So, two things informed those sculptures. One was definitely the program of architectural ornamentation that exists in the city that's so rich and hidden and embedded, as you have said and noted, and also significant sort of iconic aspects that become inhabitants of the city streets. So there's actually there's a dog, and there's a squirrel kind of embedded in the beds as well, made in concrete, and then the lion, which is about 4 feet high, and it's 1,200 pounds. It's a solid cast concrete sculpture, is a reference to the library lions in front of the New York Public Library, who have names. I mean, one is called Patience and the other one's called Fortitude. And they're in a different position. They're in a kind of sphinx-like position, and this one is sitting up. But that idea of patience and kind of having a guardian figure at either end. So I have two sort of partial portals, if you will, like a half arch wall missing half of its arch, but suggesting a kind of continuation. And the other one on the other end is an aluminum form that's a kind of upended portal that's referencing a kind of relationship and conversation with Robert Morris's plinth sculptures from the 1960s. And those plinth sculptures are actually on view on the terrace of the Whitney across town. So there's like a direct conversation, I hope, that happens with people who visit both sites. But the concrete, the materiality, it was really and this is what's happened is the work I've been doing a lot of private and public sculpture that has gone out into the garden. So the work has always, in some form, engaged the subject of the garden as a site, as a metaphoric idea, this sort of ideal and real place that is in between home and landscape writ large. But I really was interested in now trying to see what happens when you take the work that is meant for the inside world to reference an outside world. What does it mean to then take it outside? And then how does it engage with the real plants and the real scale of landscape, right? Because that's quite different. And so couple problems come up in that is how do you have work survive um, 4 seasons, right? And um, how do you account for freezing and thawing and weather and hail and winds? I mean, we had to engineer. I had a structural engineer working to make sure that these sculptures can withstand and are bolted in a way that the 100-mile-an-hour winds that hit New York would not affect them. So there's so many factors. And one of the things that's interesting about concrete is it is traditionally used in garden sculpture. I mean, it's so much of a traditional material, and it's so heavy. Again, that weight, and yet it has all these beautiful surface possibilities. It can kind of degrade and soften, become pebbly. It can over time accept moss and become plant-like. All of those changes and kind of patinas that happen in the landscape, that it's affected by the environment that it lives in, intrigued me. And I felt as though it would be less vulnerable than the ceramic sculpture to some of the factors, both public and environmental. But then also I thought it'll almost become part of the gardens over time, which I loved. That idea that aging is also quite beautiful and something I wanted to embrace. The difference, though, is that I wanted it to still have that ceramic suppleness and touch, as you were mentioning, and then that soft surface that allows for. So the models I made, and this is also for the bronze sculpture that's in the show right now at Robershon Gallery. The models I made out of oil clay. It's actually oil clay coating, very at scale. Um, um, what is it? It's like a kind of blue styrofoam, if you will. So it completely coats this, and it's hand wrought or hand added, so that it's your fingerprints are in it. It's soft and supple, and then that was what we made silicone molds from. So it really captured all that detail. So both the bronze factory I work with in Loveland, as well as the concrete fabricator Grayscape in Boulder, were incredibly skilled at really capturing the nature of the original and honoring it. So I was really thrilled with the translation, because I think that softness, that tactile surface is so important. And so what makes clay, I think, so inviting, um, so accessible, so fleshy.
Well, I'm really interested in the scale of these objects relative to a human body. And I've heard you talk about this in a lecture you gave at Crystal Bridges years ago. And you talked about how originally you were interested in ornament, and then when ornament of a flower becomes as big as the actual flower bush, and then you put it outside, what does that mean? What happens when ornament goes back to life? So can you talk about how scale sort of changes the way a person perceives space and themselves in a space?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and something that when I was I was living in Italy and I was going through the decorative arts museums all through Europe when we were traveling. I was teaching at the Cortona program in University, of Georgia, which was, I know many of my colleagues have, and it's just an amazing experience. I was really intrigued with bocage, so it's this porcelain, it's mimicking flowers at the scale of tiny, tiny porcelain flowers that usually adorn structures, a candlestick, a teapot. And they were influenced by the theater tradition of, sort of Boucher, the Romantic period, where, you have the bowers, right? Bowers that frame the actors or the lovers. So there's this hugely romantic kind of attachment to the meaning of those things, but they're tiny, they're miniaturized, and they're always at the service of the backdrop. And so I think what one of the things that my work has always been engaged in is this idea of the props. So whether it's the handheld object or these installations, is how the props, the stage property, the backdrop could become an actor, in the drama, or how we could understand it as already an actor in the drama. And that's even, architectural ornamentation. They're telling a story, with these patterns, these foliated figures, you name it. I think it's definitely a feminist vision or a feminist kind of take on um, these traditions, these decorative traditions that have, I think, long been excluded from the canon. And I think that one of the thoughts I had initially was, what if I take I think about these decorative arts traditions, I remake them not at the service of something else, at the service of the candlestick, but make them the thing itself, at the scale of the thing, or even bigger than the thing. And it claims its own centrality, right? Um, and so I started making maquettes of these small shrubs, essentially, I thinking of the abstracts or shrubs and bushes of the landscape, again, at the service of framing the doorway or marking entrance, and saying, okay, what about it being the sculptural object itself? It's minimalist, it's interesting, it is fully volumetric, it responds to so much of our own of our experience of body and presence. And so I started making these quite large, so even larger than life. So these sort of bushes and shrubs became the central sculpture in a lot of works and installations over time, and are still I'm still having, I have an installation of those works from it's like, I think 2004 to 2008, that's at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And that making them at the scale started to challenge, sculpture is about kind of our experience of our own bodies in space, right? And installation even more so. You have to walk in and amongst the work to actually experience it. It's not a passive relationship. And even the sculptures that I make that are on the wall, like those tapestry inspired pieces, they are very three-dimensional. Unlike a painting, you can't stand back and just receive the full image from any given distance. The reflection, the shadows, the you have to move your body in order to see all the different parts of the image, not unlike when you're out in nature itself and you're trying to sort of see through the leaves of the trees. This idea of discovery is part and parcel of the visual experience of those works, and a little frustrating possibly too, but about the idea that your distance from the work is constantly having to be shifted, mediated, changed, um, and and distance as a subject matter and a physical reality is part of my questioning as an artist. So uh, not only is what is our distance between where we stand and where we are and where we want to be, um, both physically and also psychologically. But what does distance have to do with desire? and the projection of our place in the future. So auguries is definitely engaging that same subject. Um, and so I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, because I think the Crystal Bridges lecture was also about, wow, taking this 20-foot wall out of the gallery where it was seemed really, really big, and putting it in the landscape. It was like, oh, this is domestic scale. Like it made it really small all of a sudden. And I mean, it still has a presence that is, so much larger than us. And so it becomes a backdrop for us. So as you walk up to it, you become surrounded by it. It's taller than you, and it incorporates you in a way. Um, but yeah, it was so interesting too, because the millefleur bleeds, the pattern that's on that large wall at Crystal Bridges is it's a swath of a backdrop of this unicorn in captivity tapestry. And I've blown it up so it's larger than life. So these like giant flowers um, are painted on the surface, and it bleeds past the confines of the wall. So the idea is that it kind of breaks down the wall. It kind of bleeds into the landscape behind it as well. So it's like unconfinable, right? Even though this is one wall and walls are all about confinement, it's really about kind of breaking down that wall. And the other side of it, which you won't see now so much because it's inside now, but in the south entrance rather than outside the south entrance, is a green wall, and it's so much about enclosure, so much about closeness, and those green ivy walls that kind of delineate the external, the outside boundaries of a space or a property. Um, and so, I was really interested in trying to have the two different physical experiences, which it really are at the heart of defining what a garden is. It's that feeling of the paradisical, like the infinite ideal landscape that goes on forever, against the one that's really about what gardens are, which are enclosures, this idea of a private space, a protected space, um, that is outside but still inside. So anyway, that idea of scale, both really forcing you to sort of experience something larger than life, and also putting us in a landscape is, I think, was really inspired by those first bush sculptures, and that was really in 2001.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. I wanted to geek out a little bit on gardens specifically. I know that you have a personal connection through your mom who's written about gardens, but also if we think about ceramics and sculpture and European gardens, like that, we've kind of always, at least in the European context, there's always been a really strong connection. But what I find interesting is how much I don't think we think about it this way now, but gardens were the flex. Like they were like, we have power, we have money, we're going to make a gigantic garden. So think about Versailles, like the ultimate flex. It's literally like showing power through control. And you've talked about it as gardens are where culture meets nature. And I think that's a really sort of phenomenal way to think about structure and how things are organized and how we want control over nature. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like looking to European garden design as a way to work?
There's so much to unpack in that question. Oh my gosh. I actually, yeah, I did a whole series of photograph. I traveled through the Loire Valley and also outside of Paris to Versailles and Saint Cloud, and did a photographic project looking at the minimalist landscape echoes in those extraordinary gardens of Le Notre and Vaux-le-Vicomte. These are oh gosh, some other incredible garden designs that from um, there was also Cavallo's garden design at Villandry, really extraordinary kinds of controlled landscapes that have so many echoes in early earthworks, and from the 60s and 70s, and also minimalist sculpture, like the corridor by Naumann. And I was like, okay, what, these are two kind of fin de siècle, like end of the era kinds of work that are so extreme, right? And so much about a kind of a reduction, but also a expansion that's and control over nature that is just off the charts. And I have to say that it's also wrapped up into power, right? And privilege and resources that one can't even conceive of that required so much labor, right? To maintain and to envision. So they have a kind of impossible project quality to them, and they're intriguing in this way, and also extreme, right? And I think that I was, to kind of give some background or context to why I was fascinated by this. As you noted, I did grow up with this very serious gardener who's continuing to be a very serious gardener into her 80s. My mother, and what, it's funny, I grew up in a big family and realized really early on that if I really wanted to have counsel with my mom, that I'd have to like kind of follow her in the garden after school and read alongside of her, and be able to kind of also get, sort of all this private time in a big family with her. I became her gardening partner too, because I was also very interested. I liked weeding. I liked the labor. I liked having earth under my hands and nails. And I think I also, along the way, got this incredible education, because one of the things that I was privy to or witnessed was her aesthetic dialogue, her internal aesthetic dialogue about what kinds of textures and shapes and formal bones, they call it, of the garden she was trying to create for all different seasons and all different relations to the architecture of the house and home. And I witnessed that as we moved to more than one home in my lifetime, as a child. So there was also this incredible artistic language for form that it developed, but also an appreciation of what it means to work at that scale, at the scale of landscape, sculpturally, right, with live material, which is crazy. And time is one of your factors. Time is one of your variables that is you're constantly in conversation with. Seasons, you know, weather. I mean, there's just so much that a gardener engages and thinks about and works with, collaborates with. Um, so I then, when I was at RISD, as an undergraduate, I studied ceramics from the get-go. I knew very early on that I just had such an affinity for this incredible material. It has so much breadth. It engages so many subjects, so many forms, so many histories. It's multicultural. It's diverse at its roots. It's just so central to our humanity. It's cuneiform, written on, our first language is written on clay. As you know, I know you, and as your audience knows, it's just encompasses and tracks human development and culture, right? This material, right? And then the fact that it is also the ground we walk on. It is that our ceramics that we know about cultures because they're excavated out of the ground and survived millennia, right? To be able to understand earlier humans and their concerns and dreams and visions. So obviously, this relationship to materiality in gardening is so closely aligned with those of us who make things right in this material. So we're mining it locally um, and appreciating it and having a conversation with it that is cyclical in nature too, right? So when I was originally studying ceramics, I also studied landscape architecture. It was sort of my plan B too, if I things didn't work out in the arts. I often thought about going back for a degree in landscape architecture and studied it as much as I could. And the history of landscape architecture really fascinated me. And I think because it's this, it's a sort of a such a basic human instinct to try to shape the landscape in the form of a kind of paradise, a kind of place we want to live in, right? Um, and that's so personal, and also it's cultural. It changes based on the tastes of the times, but and the fact that gardens are not just about a kind of beauty, but they're about, I'd say, as much about war as they are about pleasure. That there is a battle going on constantly between the vision of the human who's directing the work and the natural world and its own forces. That there's this struggle that's also embedded in the subject matter, but the actual enactment of gardening and gardens. And then, and I think, and also that there's both devastation as well as like regeneration, right? That like the subjects are not all about a kind of purification or beautification, right? They're much richer and and there are many more polarizing kinds of forces going on. And I think that's the problem also with the way in which we understand decoration, that it's this typically understood as kind of purification, this kind of gratuitous addition to things to sort of to satisfy a kind of sensual or pleasurable response. But in fact, the root of the word is really in decorum, and it's about signaling the importance or the meaningfulness of a thing or a situation or a place, right? So it's about communicating its centrality, its importance, it's the important kinds of narratives that we want to be reminded of, um, or values that we want to be reminded of, right? So there's so much more to decorative art histories even than I think we've allowed ourselves to acknowledge. And of course, if you go back in time, we're well aware of that. But I think through modernist period, we've lost touch with their values, the potential value or the instructive nature of that abstract language. I don't know if that answers your question, but like a lot to unpack in that relationship with gardens that I think is aligned with decorative art histories as well, and also like what's happened in modernist art history, what voices have been excluded, right? And I guess I'm really interested in how do you kind of bring those voices back into the dialogue and allow a space for them. And so whether those voices are the decorative histories that or the craft traditions, right, that have gone on, or women's voices or underserved populations of all sorts. So um, all kinds of communities that haven't been part of that contemporary modernist tradition of in art history. And I think we're so much more aware of that than we've ever been. So I kind of think it's maybe speaking to the converted already, or like, we're there finally.
I do want to spell it out a little bit more though, in that modernism was in some ways was an injury to the natural desire to decorate. And I think like modernism as a big M modernism, like museums, exhibitions, critics, all of that became very white, very male, very power dominated in the in the urban art scenes. But as you mentioned, like the desire to decorate and decorative arts in general has been somewhat balanced in history with men and women's work. So when you talk about putting the decorative back into a sense of power in a feminist way and claiming space, can you talk more about how you do that as an artist, but also like as a professor? How are you talking to both young men and women or non-binary folks and saying like, this is your power. How are you going to use your power? How are you teaching students to use their power? Maybe is the bigger
It's the central question, right? I think giving permission. I think so much of what we do as professors, I think, or at least how I see my role as a professor, is extending permission. I think so much in our world is there, is about no, you can't, no, not that, nope, that doesn't, nope. And I think allowing people to take risk to exercise their voice, and that's what I wanted to say. It's really about giving them the permission to use their voice, to say what they need to say, in whatever form that takes. And it's that in the act of extending permission to take risk in that way is also a validating act, right? So it says what you are even trying to say or what you care to say is valid. It is important, and we need to hear it. You must say it. We want to hear it. We need to make space to hear it, and that's the incredible opportunity the Academy can afford, which is to create that space and audience that is of all in a similar state of inquiry and a vulnerable state of inquiry, to allow for those voices to develop, be heard, seen, understood, and acknowledged before they go out into the public realm. To be, it's a kind of care, attention and care that is hugely important for the development of all culture, but new ideas or old ideas, but just unheard ones, right? So when I think you're right that traditionally perhaps there were sort of gender, perhaps categories of study that were gendered. I don't feel that's the case. I don't I don't feel that's ever been the case, but I feel like that's happened, um, perhaps out as a way that culture has simplified understanding of things. So in my own teaching, I don't think I try not to discuss any, and I don't feel that there's any subject that somehow belongs necessarily to one sort of gender or one identity. And I think that if we reduce that ability to engage in ideas and all across all cultures and traditions, um, that we then potentially exclude understanding, or the ability to understand deeply, or to grapple with, or to embrace, or like all of these, or to be speaking to and in conversation with, right? These are all the things that we allow for in the Academy, ideally, is that there's no subject off limits, that there's no tradition that is to not part of the full experience and canon, if you will. So I think that's how I approach it, both as an artist as well as someone who is a practitioner in a position to, um, I think, make space for conversation, make space for learning, is to make that space widely inclusive, you know, uh, and it's a great privilege. I also want to say to be in that position. So I take that responsibility very seriously as well. You have a lot of power to shape the conversation if you're doing that, and so to be really cognizant. And I think one of the things that really for me, and I appreciate that this is not the you're foregrounding my voice right now, and I'm very grateful for that. But in the academy, it's not about me. It's about the community that I'm part of. It's about me giving the space to hear other voices and encourage those other voices to be to come into the public into that realm, whatever that space is. Um, so a lot of it is not about my ideas or my interests or my, it's about I'm really wanting to hear and what the artists in the room, what the students in the room are thinking, questioning, inspired by, needing, right? Grappling with what are their questions. So gosh, it's yeah, it's I think it's a very vulnerable place. And I also try to frame it as a kind of both a monastic space of inquiry and also like this awesome extended artist residency. Like, wow, I have all these amazing resources and people, a community here to engage with. How do I take full advantage of that? So rather than to see it as a space of scrutiny, which is I think how we typically understand the academy is this sort of scrutinizing ideas. And yes, we're deeply engaging ideas in a rigorous manner, but it's not it's not at the behest of like judgment. We're not trying to judge what's good and what's bad. It's not about that. It's about understanding the nuance of any kind of line of inquiry, right? And I think that I think it's part of the language, it's part of the history. That it has a that conversations tend to feel defensive, right? Rather than exploratory. And so I'm really kind of saying, no, experiment, explore, dig in, take it seriously. What do you care about? What do you love? How do you communicate that love, right? Like, I mean, that's where we need to dive in and commit and trust, right? Ourselves and others.
Well, this is a great segue into the grad program. One of the reasons that I wanted to have you on is so that potential students can get to know you and potentially come and study with you. So, can you talk a little bit more about the program and what you see as the values of the program?
Yeah, it's so funny because we are just talking about this just last year, and Scott Chamberlain, Jeannie Quinn, and I have been teaching together now for 25 years, and well, I mean, in the sense that it's a complementary program, and we engage each other as well as engage our students. So, I mean, I feel like we've been really blessed by having a very fruitful dialogue, the three of us, as artists and also as colleagues. And a long time, right? A long-term relationship. Yeah, we've just been so blessed to have this longevity, right? And then also to see our students that we've graduated over time establish their own programs, be such incredible contributors to the field and the dialogue within the field and beyond that. And then also they sometimes send their students to study with us. So there's like this kind of amazing a giving back that's so beautiful in cycles of generations, right? At this point of students in dialogue with us and and um, and these amazing artists we've had the privilege to work with. I think that our philosophy hasn't changed. I think from the very start of our collaboration 25 years ago, I think what we want to do, and I'm speaking as a we, but I'll and shift it to myself. But I know that Jeannie and Scott also feel the same way. And that's actually why we work so well together, is that we're interested in the person. So when we bring somebody to campus and even in the visits and the interviews, it's not just them as an artist or the work they do, but it's them as a human being. And think about what can we offer you in this short dialogue, 2.5 year dialogue, maybe 3 year dialogue, that could help you as an artist, that could support you and move you forward in the practice that you're developing. And then we also just really think about people as these MFAs that come in as artists, so they can work with any material, they can work in any way in practice, they can develop their criteria based on their own needs. Um, that we don't have a agenda for them. We don't have oh, you came into making this work, so you must continue to make this work. It's like, oh, you came in with these really interesting ideas. And we're so interested to hear and see how you develop those, if those are the ideas that you want to continue to work with. If those ideas shift and change, that's compelling too. How can we support you going forward to really give um, to really dig into those ideas and questions and concepts and their material meanings too, right? Like how material and process and all of that stuff supports what it is you need to make. And we want to get to that need to make question, right? There's so much we do out of habit or training, but what's necessary? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What is absolutely non-negotiable that you are driven to have to understand more deeply through the practice, right? So that's like I think where we land, and then how we can support you through a very intimate dialogue throughout your career at CU is what we try to do. And we encourage them to bring in professors from all different disciplines that are and take classes outside of the art and art history department to supplement their research interests and needs. And then we also we try to support them also if they're interested in pedagogy and interested in going on to teach themselves, which many are, though absolutely not, again, an agenda or a need necessarily dictated by the program. But if they are, to take that very seriously and to ask them periodically throughout their teaching experiences, what is it they want to give their students as experiences, right? What's the most important thing you want your students to know and understand and have experienced when they leave your class? Like, that's the big question. What is it you're engaging in this subject? What are those meaningful dialogues and questions and experiences you're offering? And it's a question we're always asking ourselves, right? But that's central.
And I think it's a question that changes over time, or maybe the answer to the question changes over time. Because I think about programs that are successful as MFA programs and undergrad, it's when the teachers, when they do what I think of as live teaching, like they're not teaching the curriculum they taught the year before because it's a habit. Their teaching is not habitual. Their teaching is thriving and living and breathing.
You have to you're evolving as a human being. And so your question and the culture is evolving and your response to it. Same with your students' response to it. So it is necessarily an evolving dialogue and set of, and the projects and questions you're engaged. Yeah, all of that is, I think it has to. Otherwise, it's it isn't the language isn't even relevant. And the language can be out of touch with where we are emotionally and intellectually, right? So yeah, language is such a huge part of every practice, but ours as well, right? So how do we even talk about this differently now?
To wrap up, can you plug the show again and tell people how they can see it? And then also your social media or a way that people could contact you?
Thanks so much, Ben, for this conversation. I feel like we could talk for about 4 more hours, or at least your questions are so rich that I could continue to kind of think about them for. The exhibition at Robichon is Auguries is up until December 30th, and it's in Lodo, or the lower downtown of Denver, and I am posting periodically images of different works that are in the show on my Instagram account, and descriptions of what influenced those pieces and their materiality and scale and all that. And that Instagram account is at Kim P. Dickey, all one word. And then I very soon will be updating my website, which also will have images of the exhibition that I hope people can see if they can't come to Denver in person. And that's kimdickeystudio.com. So thank you for that. And thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it. It's good to connect.
Same. Thanks so much, Ben.
I'd like to thank Kim for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with her about her work. This is going to be our last episode of 2023, so I wanted to thank you all for tuning in and being a part of the show this last year. We are seeking sponsors for 2024, so if you'd like to be a sponsor, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. Hope you all have a happy holiday, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.